So thank you so much for your patience. We are now ready to start. A warm welcome to our roundtable on the question, how green is socialism? This is one roundtable in a series of roundtables that we have been organizing over the last couple of years on rethinking socialism. I'm very happy to have Nancy Fraser and Raul Zelik here. I have to announce that unfortunately Klaus Dörre had to cancel last minute due to a COVID infection. So nothing that we could do about that. As you have seen, we have tried to make it possible to keep your distance in this room. If it's, I think it's okay as we sit now, but just remember to wear your masks and not to get too close. I mean, we were very happy to get this room in order to have a bit more space. And one last technical issue, please put your cell phones on a flight modus, because we're going to record the discussion, and as our technician says, it's going to disturb the production and the record if you have your cell phones on. So please shut down your cell phones. So I'm very happy, by the way, that this is why we are a bit delayed, that Raul, who just came from the train, who was delayed, is here now. So in the run-up to today's discussion, Raul Zelik wrote on Twitter, it's Friday 13th and we have bad news. Capitalism will not be able to come to terms with the ecological crisis. So this as the headline and the motto for our roundtable in the discussion. And in fact, from an ecological point of view, capitalism is not doing well. It seems to have considerable disadvantages. The logic of growth, who depletes existing resources and in an ever-increasing speed. And also, as some of our guests here have brought forward, capitalism's reward system somehow incentivizes people to exploit natural wealth free of charge. So for some reasons, for one or the other reasons, all of our guests tonight seem to come to this conclusion that capitalism cannot solve the problem that it causes with respect to the ecological resources and the crisis. And all of them, both of them that we have here now, propose to think about a socialist alternative to capitalism as a solution for this problem. So when Raul says capitalism will not be able to solve the crisis, the suggestion is some kind of green socialism will be able to solve it, and this is the kind of questions that we are going to discuss today. Let me just shortly introduce both of our guests. Nancy Fraser is the Henry and Louise Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research in New York, and various other positions at Dartmouth, for example, and some professorships that she seems to collect somehow all over the world. She is one of the most prominent, most important critical theorists of our time, and capitalism has been the focus of her work for quite a long time. In a recent article, Climates of Capital, she applies what she has developed as an expanded conception of capitalism as an institutional order to the question of ecological crisis. So this is the reason why we are going to talk with Nancy Fraser today about green socialism and capitalism's inability to solve the ecological crisis. I also want to mention that she's not only professor at New York, but also our Benjamin Chair for this year. So she's spending a couple of weeks with us and is going to deliver 3 lectures on 3 phases of capitalist labor beginning June 14th. And this is one of the, this is very exciting that her stay here that has been postponed due to Corona actually for 2 years is finally happening. We are so excited to have you here, and this is one of the first public discussions that we're going to have, and as you all know, this is going to be continued with another roundtable on racial capitalism, and then finally with the Benjamin lectures on the 3 phases of capitalist labor. So a warm welcome to Nancy. I'm really, really happy that you're here. This is somehow the continuation of a long-standing, friendship and cooperation, and yes, it's going to be great to have you here for all those events and for the internal and public discussions. Raul Zelik is an author, a political scientist, and a translator. Raul was an associate professor for international politics at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia and taught political theory in Berlin and Kassel and Bogota. He has been working a lot on the Spanish-speaking world, actually. I mean, not only Latin America, but also the Spanish-speaking world in general. His most recent book, though, is on the concept of green socialism. Wir Untoten des Kapitals, roughly translated into zombies of capital, about political monsters and a green socialism. So this is the reason why we have invited Raul, and we have wanted to do this for quite a while. And if I may mention, I mean, we have known each other for quite a while, but have never been on a round table together. So I'm very, very happy to have you, and very happy to share this discussion between the two of you. We'll roughly cover 3 topics and then have a Q&A. The 3 topics are going to be, and I'm just going to ask you to ask questions without, one after the other. The first question is, why is capitalism not green? Why is it actually unable to solve the ecological crisis? And is that so? Are there systemic, structural reasons for capitalism not being able to solve it? What kind of what is going on here so that capitalism should not be able to come up with the kind of innovative solutions that some people would think capitalism is always able to, as a very dynamic system, is always able to come up with. Second part is on the question of socialism. So how green is actually socialism? How would socialism be able to solve the problem? And then we'll have a final part on the question of what has been called real socialism not only in history, but also since Raul is a specialist, for example, and has written extensively, for example, on Venezuela and the Venezuelan experience with socialism, the question of how the track record of socialist countries with respect to the ecology, whether this is something that should somehow warn us or make a difference for the way we conceptualize green socialism. So, first question: why is capitalism unable to solve the ecological crisis, and is that so? Nancy, in your text, in Climates of Capital, you write that economic actors in capitalism are systematically primed to free rider nature that cannot really self-replenish without limit. As a result, you argue capitalism's economy is always on the verge of destabilizing its own ecological conditions of possibility. So, in one sense, this is very convincing. The thought is very convincing. So the whole problem of externalizing costs and, as I said, the dynamics of growth seems to speak in favor of your thesis. But with the second thought, one might think, yeah, but how is that so? Why is it, and is it a structural, a systematic problem that, or is it just the case that for the time being, or capitalism has not come up with a solution and is going to do so anytime soon? So your thesis that this is really something that is systematic, is in the DNA of capitalism, not to be able to solve the ecological crisis or to cause an ecological crisis. Maybe you could explain a bit how this is so, and on which level you would argue for this.
This is working, yeah. Thank you so much, Rahel, and it's a great pleasure to be back in Berlin, to be back in conversation with you, and now with Raul. I'm really happy, and this topic could not be more important and more timely. So my answer is actually a bit complicated. I hope it's not schizophrenic. Here's what I mean. I do believe, and I'll try to explain how, that there are structural, systemic features of capitalism that make it trash nature, that this is not accidental, that this is built in. And I do believe that those structural tendencies inhere in every form of capitalism, but have become especially horrific under the present regime of financialized neoliberal capitalism, which has destroyed or hollowed out the kinds of public powers that that even a capitalist society would need if it were going to try to take this thing seriously. So we're in a deep mess, and there's no question in my mind that Jason Moore and his friends are right to say that this is not, it's not the problem of humanity, the problem is capital, it's not the Anthropocene, but the Capitalocene, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, to lay out the system logic, and what I just said pertains to the system logic, to lay that out is not yet to talk about real historical social formations. And when you actually implant that system logic in an institutionalized social order, in time and in space, then I think it becomes more difficult to say exactly what can and what cannot happen. Because it's true that capitalism has, I don't know if one should say reinvented itself, or at least been reinvented by somebody, several times. And even very astute thinkers like Marx and Engels on the one side or Karl Polanyi on the other would have said that, New Deal capitalism was kind of impossible. You couldn't put marketization and social protection together. They were very smart people, smarter than I am. So I'm a little bit I'm a little bit wary of saying this is absolutely impossible. On the other hand, I will give you my systematic argument, which will suggest that if it's not absolutely impossible, it's highly unlikely, both for structural reasons, but also because I don't see a path. Even if we could imagine a green capitalism, I don't see a path from here to there. And that's a whole nother problem. Something that might be possible in theory, if there's no way there, then it becomes impossible. Anyway, my systematic argument has to do with the reliance of the whole process of capital accumulation and the sort of official economy in which that process is thought to be anchored, the reliance of that on a whole set of background conditions that appear as external to the official economy and appear to contain forms of wealth that are not yet translated into value terms or not fully capitalized. And my view is that, and this is a bit of a heretical claim vis-a-vis Marxism, my view is that I call myself a Marxist, and yet I still want to say most Marxists have not taken seriously enough how much profit relies not on surplus value, accumulated through exploitation of free wage labor at the point of production, but on appropriation of wealth outside the official economy that is not replenished, remunerated, repaired, et cetera, et cetera. And I make the same argument, by the way, with respect to unwaged care work and social reproductive activity, with respect to nature, with respect to public power. That is, I'm interested to hear that you're using the zombie metaphor. I'm using cannibal. It is cannibalized by this accumulation process. That there's just a deep, deep incentive to capital to not pay for inputs, and not just inputs, but general background conditions of the environmental sort, to trash them and just take no responsibility at all for repairing and replenishing. That's built into the system every bit as much as the incentive to not pay for all the hours that free proletarians work in a factory, right? The system doesn't work if there aren't any surplus hours and surplus value to be appropriated by the capitalists. It also doesn't work, here's my additional, if all the externalized costs are paid for. If capital is forced to pay for that full bill of damage, of care work that's been absorbed, of ecological destruction, of public goods supplied by states and other public powers, of all the wealth of racialized populations that it sucks up without paying for. If it's forced to pay for all of that, there is no surplus, there is no profit. As profit comes not only in the form of surplus value. That's my systematic argument. From what I can see, it's logically sound and convincing. But as I say, when we think about, part of the issue is semantic. You could imagine all kinds of constraints on capital that would either tax it very, very steeply to pay for damage, or actually outlaw it from producing more damage in the first place, or at least some of it. You could imagine efforts to do this kind of stuff, and I would be strongly in favor of such efforts. How far you could get with that, I think you could make some progress, but how far you can get, could you get far enough and fast enough, given the ticking clock here? I really doubt it. And then there'd be questions also as to what you would end up with in the end. The constraints on capital would have to be so severe that many people might say, well, this isn't capitalism anymore. What are we calling, what's our definition of capitalism here? So anyway, it's a mixed answer, a complicated answer.
We'll have a second round on this too. But I want to bring Raul in now in this conversation. So one of the things, according to your thesis, why is capitalism not able to solve the ecological problem? How does it come, how does it run into ecological problems in the first part? And since you have been stressing property so much and defending the thesis that without changing property relations, there will be no way to solve the ecological crisis. So maybe you can explain a little bit what your thoughts are.
Yeah, first I want to thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here and to discuss it with you. Well, I would say, or I would remind what we discussed in Jena in the cluster about post-growth societies. And you know that for 10 years or 12 years there was a discussion. Nancy also had had a fellowship there, and I think the discussions there were about what is the reason or the necessity of growth in capitalist societies, and some people argued that it's kind of epistemology, ideology, consumerism, so kind of collective values in modern societies. And there was the other thesis with which I agreed a lot, of Jason Moore and Elmar Altvater and Birgit Mahnkopf, who said no, and Klaus Dörre, no, we have to talk about Capitalocene. We have we have to consider the necessity of accumulation of capital. And I think the reason is very clear. So accumulation needs growth, economic growth. And well, then you have to see that any kind of work and work process, labor process, is a kind of metabolism with nature. Yeah, so it's a transformation of nature. Yeah. And the big promise of neoliberal Greens like Ralph Fuchs, and now I think it's more or less what his theoretic thinking is, the proposal of our Ampel government in Germany. They say, no, we can disconnect the accumulation of values from the metabolism. We can get into a perfect Kreislaufwirtschaft, circuit economy. And there's no argument to consider that this could be true, because if you see, we have already a history of 20 years of so-called green economies, which could be a substitution of brown economy. You know, they told us now with globalization, digitalization, we enter a new epoch of ecological economy, where we move in clouds, in virtual value processes, and if we can see it very clearly that that the energy consumption of all the virtual reality is huge. Yeah, we have more carbon emissions as a result of internet traffic than from flights, yeah, from air transport. So we can see that this idea of a virtual economy that moves in clouds is not real. You need physical infrastructure. You need the cables. You need the energy for the whole infrastructure. We have in Berlin now, for example, a new how you call this, Rechnerzentrum, yeah, like this internet farms, they call it here, yeah. And this in the south of Berlin, and this consumes more than the 300,000 of inhabitants of the neighborhood. So it's very clear this is not true that we can get into a virtual economy where we have value production, but we have no metabolism with nature. So it is true that efficiency can become stronger and more important, but it won't be this end of transformation of nature. So this is very clear. And I would also argue what Klaus Dörre, because he's not with us, I would like to argue what he always defended. Well, I think you already said this, we have the kind of externalization of a permanent process of externalization in markets and in capitalism. And Klaus, in a tradition of Rosa Luxemburg and David Harvey, always argued that on the other hand of this normal process of accumulation, we have this accumulation by Landnahme. This is what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession, or what Rosa Luxemburg is defending as a permanent process of primitive accumulation. So she says in her writing about imperialism that, the idea that primitive accumulation is finished is not true, that capitalism always needs some kind of outside, to colonize. And I think this is really convincing if you see all the ecological problems and all the kind of appropriation of land in South America. It is very clear that this is exactly happening now. That we have a process of colonization of peasant and indigenous lands, for example, in Amazonas. And we are transforming, we as capitalist society, world society, we are transforming a very rich, biodiversity rich area into, a green desert. And this is the process of valorization. So you see that this is huge in Mato Grosso and Amazonia. They have huge, very strong indices of growth. And in reality, this is a process of terrible destruction, not only of society, but also of nature, or a destruction of this biodiversity. So I think it is very clear that capitalism needs this process of expansion and in space, not only, and it also needs an intensification in time, So this is the reason why I use the metaphor of zombie, because I think capitalism transforms us in a kind of undead of object of this process of accumulation. We are not free to take any decisions on this social process, but we have just to follow what this law of accumulation imposes us. So this, I think this is really convincing. So in many points we could discuss about Marxism, but I think in this description of the process of expansion, it is very clear that this is true, and this is empirically also proven by reality, because we are talking about climate change and ecological turn for 40, 50 years already, and nothing is happening. So if political desire is there and nothing is happening, then the reason is what? I think it's the law of accumulation.
I mean, two standard arguments against this would be the innovative force and dynamics of capitalism, as you know, and the other one is the question, and Nancy Sommer already gave an answer to this. I mean, if capitalism is an institutional order, and if it depends also on a political order, political structure, why are political regulations? I mean, why is it not possible to solve the problems through political regulations on the one hand, and why is it on the other side not an important part of overcoming the crisis to go for the kind of innovative potential, the sustainability capitalism? And here I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate in some way, because I mean, this is something that constantly comes up when discussing those issues. People say, you know, there's no other system that could be as innovative as capitalism is in order to come up with a solution, even if you agree that it has created the crisis in the first place. It's also going to solve it through this kind of innovative power. So why would you say this is not a good solution, not a viable solution?
So I do think we will need innovation to solve this problem. But I deeply object to the idea that capitalism has a monopoly on the ability to innovate. I don't see why a socialist society can't do that, can't bring together all kinds of intelligent people and pay them decent salaries and create conditions where they can really inspire each other to innovate. It's like saying capitalism invented science or something. No, these things might be distorted by capitalism, but they are not capitalist inventions or things on which capitalism has a monopoly. Now, the problem is the kinds of innovation that are at least now being talked about in the so-called green capitalist universe. Some of them are totally insane, you know, like I don't know, shooting carbon deep into the earth or way into the atmosphere, or, I mean, these are really scary scenarios. So, you know, I mean, it really depends on what kind of innovation we're talking about. Some of the reasons that lead me to worry about capitalist innovation, first of all, there are all the issues of sunk costs. Of you know, big concentrations of capital that don't want to see certain kinds of innovations that devalue their already existing intellectual property or everything else. Intellectual property is a whole nother big problem. You know, we saw how quickly some pretty effective vaccines were developed, and now we're told that they are the private property of corporations like, in my case, Moderna. Most of the work was actually done by the National Institutes of Health, a government agency, and now they've gone and filed an application for a private patent. So, you know, they will only innovate if it's profitable, and that requires that they continue to get royalties and more profits on all of this. So I think socialism could be more innovative, actually. We wouldn't have to face those kinds of problems. You also asked about political regulation. Well, there have been certain kinds of political regulations. Many people, maybe in Germany, don't know this. Many people in the U.S. don't know it. But you know, the U.S. is today the world's worst climate denialist, right, center, a real laggard even within the capitalist, you know, world system. But in the Environmental Protection Agency, created in 1970, there was and still exists in a somewhat hollowed out form the so-called Superfund, which was based on the principle polluter pays. It was, in other words, cleanup paid for by taxes on the petroleum industry and the chemical industries, Dow Chemical, et cetera, et cetera. This is you know, the use of coercive state power against corporations is a good thing. It's a much better thing than the carrot approach of, you know, carbon trading, buying and selling offsets, and all of that kind of stuff. There's nothing like the stick, in my opinion, if you want to go after polluters and bad firms. So I guess the question would be, you know, is that, I don't think that's an end point, but I think that's not a bad transitional socialist strategy, so to speak, to organize for that sort of thing. And the only problem is, in many, many cases, this has to be instituted transnationally at a global level. The US EPA didn't care a hoot about Dow Chemical napalming Vietnam. They only cared about if rivers in Pittsburgh, right? So, you know, we have to, these really destructive corporations are mega global corporations, and we don't have the ability right now to do anything to them. I just want to say one thing to Raul. I'm not sure exactly where you stand on this growth question, but I have to say that I always found the category growth not a helpful category for analyzing these things, because, and I've said this before to Rahel, I think what has to grow in capitalism is value. And what absolutely is not allowed to grow in capitalism are use values that meet human needs, vast quantities of unmet human needs across the planet that don't contribute to private profit. That sort of growth is absolutely blocked. So for me, I'm also, you know, in the same vein, what do we say about all the growth in fictitious capital, which is such a huge part of the current form of capitalism? Just this mass of paper values that seems in the end to connect to very little that's material. I'm thinking of the near global financial meltdown of 2007-08, which was caused just by trading pieces of paper on mortgages. No one was building any new houses or anything like that. They were just finding poor people of color to suck into contracts that were deeply predatory and then got bought and sold up to the kazoo. So in others, what I'm trying to say is that I think socialists should be thinking about, you know, qualitative questions. Growth is a quantitative category. It's too gross, it's too crude. There are plenty of things that I think we do want to grow, but just not capital and not all the damage that goes along with capital.
So we're already approaching the second question of the the question of how socialism then would solve the problem, and how the institutions should and would look like that would solve the problem under a socialist agenda. I mean, Raul, you have been focusing a lot on social control and have argued that those collective structures are always doing better in terms of resources, and maybe also in terms of innovation. I don't know whether you would go for this, but so what kind of technological innovation, what kind of social structure would we need in order to arrive at an ecological socialism, at a green socialism? What's your idea of socialism here?
Yeah. If you allow, I would say some words about the question before, because I also I totally agree with what Nancy said, but I wanted to contribute some more arguments. The innovation in socialist society. I was in Cuba in December, and it is really terrifying to get a teeth brush there. But the country has 5 vaccines. They developed in a situation of total economic embargo, in which they couldn't even buy the pharmaceutical stuff in the world market. They developed 5 very efficient vaccines. I have no explanation why they could, but it is true. It's working. Yeah, the vaccines, Abdallah and Soberana 1, 2, they have the same efficiency as the BioNTech stuff. Yeah, 95%, and this is really amazing. So you see that state planification perfectly is contributing to innovation too. So the other argument could be, if you see that mobility problem in our society, we have studies of the Umweltbundesamt, the German government, which says that the most ecological form of transport, of course, is public transport, and the old bus is as efficient ecologically as trains. So the new electric cars, they won't ameliorate the ecological situation, because they have a lot of consumption of metals and of energy for the production. They calculate that an ecological car has to be driven something like 120,000 kilometers to be better than a normal gas car. So the truth is that in mobility we don't need so much technological innovation and new industries, but more collective infrastructures. If we returned to the traditional public transport system, and a transport system which really gets to the villages and all of this, the ecological result would be better than the construction of 30 or 40 millions of electric cars for Germany. So I think this is very clear. Of course, I'm not against innovation, but I think it is very clear that the solution if we have to reduce the metabolism with nature, and I think this is the idea of sustainability, that we have to reduce this metabolism to a level of natural circuits, of natural reproduction. If we want to get there, then we have to strengthen collective infrastructure, and we have to debilitate individual consumerism. So I think, the problem or the contribution of innovation could be interesting, could be important, but more important is a change of our way of life and production.
Can I push you a bit on this? I mean, reducing the metabolism with nature, would this mean that we would still live in an industrial society, or would it mean to somehow de-industrialize our way of living? So what is the...
I totally agree with Nancy, what she said before, that we have to look for necessities and Bedürfnis in English is necessity, needs, I'm always thinking in Spanish, so I'm so sorry. The needs, and then of course we have to take a political or a societal decision on what we want. So I don't agree with these like Arturo Escobar, this thinking in some parts of Latin America, and especially now in Europe and North America, which is kind of idealization of pre-industrial forms of living, because also indigenous people are really happy that their kids don't die from illness. No? So I think it is clear that we need. We cannot opt for deindustrialization, but we have to decide which kind of industries we want to have and under which conditions, social and ecological conditions. So I think before you argue with regulations, of course, I think regulation is an instrument. Expropriation could be another, unthinkable at the moment because of the correlation of forces, but we should think about these other strategies too. And then you ask about my socialist concept. Well, I think for me, socialism should not be a model to be imposed on society. Should not be a concept, a defined concept on how we want to build our society. I think we should understand socialism more like this movement, collective movement of reappropriation of life and of decisions. So I think in Marx you have this famous sentence which says in German, Kommunismus ist für uns nicht der zu erreichende Zustand, sondern die Bewegung, die reale Bewegung, die im Hier und Jetzt angreift, which means more or less communism for us is not a status we want to arrive to, but the real movement which is resulting from the conditions of today. This is more or less the sentence of Marx. So I think the socialist movement historically was the movement of decommodification. It was we could also argue with Karl Polanyi, who said there is this movement of re-embedding of the markets. Yeah, it's the movement, the social and collective movement, which puts limits to capital and to valorization. And in that sense, I would argue that we have to understand, in difference, in contrast, what we had socialism in 20th century. And so the socialism of 20th century was a socialism of ideas, of very vulgar ideas of progress, of technological progress. And I think we should get into a socialism which parts from this, that the metabolism with nature is limited and has to be limited if we don't want to destroy our possibilities of reproduction. And this should be the first point, and the other point should be that we have to understand socialism as a kind of democratization of society in defining not only our political sphere, but also our economic sphere and the sphere of labor, of work. So this is the great tragedy of liberal society, that they promise a democratic constitution of society, but their property relations are totally feudalistic and despotic. So I think we have to understand socialism as a movement of real democratization, of profound democratization of these other spheres of society. Boaventura de Sousa Santos said once that we are living in a democracy as in an archipelago of small islands of democracy in the sea of despoty. And I think this is a good idea of the real constitution of liberal society, that it's not true that this is a democratic society. So I understand socialism as a movement of reappropriation of democratic decision-making and of ecological aims or here the English limitations, but you got the idea. Yeah.
We'll get back to this. Nancy, how would socialism solve the problem, and what kind of socialism is this going to be, according to your position?
Well, I'm in a bind because I like this rhetoric about socialism being the real movement, but I also actually think, and maybe here I'm talking more about, the politics of the moment. I actually think we need actually to define what the project, what the desired society will look like, and have some kind of a program. That might be an unfashionable statement. So I believe that's necessary, but I have very little clue as to what exactly it should be. I have a few principles, and the one that follows most directly from what we've been saying here is the principle pay as you go, by which I mean no externalization of costs. You use it, you pay for it. It goes in the account books. I don't mean literally. It's in the overall reckoning of what the society is doing. All costs, everything that is used, everything that is harmed, hopefully not so much, but maybe there still would be some harm. All of that is accounted, and there is no externalization onto either powerless populations that have been deprived of the means of self-defense and can't fight back when their lands are taken, no externalization onto women's presumed natural talent for social reproductive labor, no externalization of unpaid ecological costs and damages, and so that everything is replenished. I think that's what it should mean. I don't know if that necessarily means reducing the metabolism. I'm not even sure I understand that phrase, what it means to reduce your metabolism with nature. I mean, I think we're always mutually metabolizing with nature, and it might mean what some environmental economists call reducing throughput. I'm not even sure that we need to reduce throughput if it's the right kind of throughput, and if we are really not externalizing. But you could say pay as you go. You could also call it clean up as you go. Don't leave a mess and expect someone else to clean it up. That's very, very important to me. I think another principle of socialism, I don't think I have an institutional picture, but I have some principles. That's the best I can do. Another principle is non-domination. Look, environmental destruction is deeply entwined with this kind of Landnahme process. The nature that capital expropriates and trashes is almost always the habitat of some human group for whom this bit of nature constitutes the material base of their community reproduction, their social reproduction. It's a meaning-laden place where they live. You cannot, to my mind, separate the ecological problematic from the problematic of imperialism and of the global color line. This is really all about color and racialization. And that's true within countries. I mean, you know, we are famous for Flint, Michigan's water debacle, Flint being an overwhelmingly African-American city near Detroit. We are famous for the destruction of the 9th Ward of New Orleans, a vibrant black working class neighborhood destroyed by Katrina and not rebuilt, and so on. So I'm sure that there are comparable stories here as well. On the other hand, I do want to say that I'm on the one hand heartened by the relatively recent attention to environmental injustice, environmental racism, and so on within anti-racist social movements. On the other hand, I feel very strongly that if one focuses exclusively on the disparate impacts, you will miss that main central cannibal that is going, and that it's not about let's find some equality in extreme vulnerability. That's not what we're looking for. But non-domination is a principle, and I will sign on to democratization. To me, the biggest need is for a level of social planning, societal planning of the course of development. And that has been expropriated by capital's monopoly on surplus, which it decides what to do with. Socialism, the deepest meaning for me of socialism is collective ownership of social surplus, which implies collective decision-making about what to do with it, including, maybe this gets to the question about decreased metabolism, including the decision about whether to produce any surplus at all. At least once we've cleaned up all the mess and met all the unmet needs, we might decide we don't want to do that. That's, to me, the deepest meaning of socialism. And I think that's a different question from the question of markets. I am not against all markets. No markets for basic needs. Basic needs have to be met as public goods and not as commodities. No markets in allocation of surplus. But that leaves a lot of room in between. Markets are not, by definition, capitalist. People all over the world buy and sell things in villages and so on. They have markets. This has nothing to do with capitalism. We have to give up the idea that in being anti-capitalist, we're talking about eliminating markets. And maybe that starts to get to the problem of real socialism a little bit. But.
Before I ask the last question to Raul, we are going to have the Q&A right after Raul has answered the last question. Please queue. I mean, do you see the mic in the middle of the room? So the Q&A is going to work like you queue at this mic, in front of this mic, and then we are just taking, one after the other. With some, I will have a look at the gender dimension of who's queuing, so I might prefer women to speak if there's a disproportion. So please queue at the mic. And now I'm going to ask Raul one last thing about, you both agree on not giving a blueprint of a socialist society and not imposing the idea of a socialist society. So it should not only be democratic, but it's also, the idea is that it should be achieved in a democratic way, and that, this is what I take from your idea that this is the real movement and some existing practices, some existing social movements that are already asking for the kind of democratic control. One thing that I found interesting in the way you talk about Venezuela, though, is that for some reason you argue against the idea of, let's say, an immediate democratic self-rule. So you have been somehow critical about what was going on in Venezuela, also on the level of the political institutions and the structures. So maybe you can say a little bit more about, I mean, at least what kind of structures you don't want to include in your idea of socialism.
I wanted to go back to the question of what is socialism, because I think, when I said that it is not a defined program, I didn't want to say that we have only some vague ideas or some vague principles. No, I think it is very clear what has to be done politically. I would say that if it's true that we have to fight for a decommodification of society and nature, then we have to put limits to private property and to valorization. And then it's very clear what we have to do politically. Yeah? We have to strengthen all kind of social fights, as we had here in Berlin, against this Deutsche Wohnen, or this properties, the big land and housing owners, and all kind of political fights with labor unions. Yeah. But we also have to defend to make visible the idea that we already have very important experiences with a process of socialization, because in the 20th century there has been a strong process of building, for example, public education, public health systems, public transport systems in capitalist society, but also in socialist societies. And I think we have to go back to these experiences. So we have to strengthen these kind of collective infrastructures, infrastructures that satisfy immediate needs. We have to discuss how to democratize these structures, because we see that state property in many times hasn't worked too well, but we have experiences with a kind of democratic self-government of public infrastructures. For example, university, well, we know that it's not really democratized as we want, but it is an interesting idea to build a public structure which is, well, financed by the state, but it's not controlled directly by the state, or public media, or public health system in Germany. So we could, apart from this idea, we could try to push forward a kind of process of building these public democratic infrastructures. And we could go back to the commons, to the traditional commons of peasant societies, or the new digital commons, which these experiences show us that it is possible to self-organize common property and to take care of the resources, and to take into consideration the cycles of reproduction of nature. And so I think there are a lot of experiences, and it was interesting that the leader of the Social Democrats in Switzerland and a comrade of the labor movement there, Beat Ringer and Zelik, they wrote a book that is called a Service Public Revolution, which means the revolution of public services. And they say we should think about a socialism which is built up on these experiences of public infrastructures, and which could invade also the world of industries, because there is no argument why self-government, I know this is a relative self-government of public universities, for example, work, and it's not working in a factory. Well, it could work in a factory, and we could think about a public organizing of, for example, the production of mobility products. Yeah, we don't want to have cars, but we need other forms for the mobility. So I think it's not true that we don't have a program what could be socialist. We don't have the strength, the force, the power to materialize these ideas, but it is very clear what we could and should do. So the other argument, Venezuela, well, I followed the process because I lived some years before already in Colombia, and then I went from 2003 on. I returned to Venezuela. I'd been there from the 80s. And well, for me, it was a really amazing and interesting process because it was totally unexpected, and it came with new political subjects. Yeah, where the traditional left had no major role in this process, and it came really from poor neighborhoods and from parts of the army, which was also very surprising to me. And well, I think there were. There is this big problem, and there's no time now to get really to the point or the issue of the problem of Venezuela. But I think in some very short drafts, you could say the problem of Venezuela is it's totally dependent on oil, and so you have a totally inflated state, and then you had a socialist movement which, on one hand, tried to strengthen communities, what was really interesting and positive. But on the other hand, they said our main instrument is the state, which is comprehensible, but they reproduce the old problems. So an inflated state was inflated more. And so you had a really dramatic process of bureaucratization, and also of personalization of power, because all was about the figure of Chavez. Because you have to understand that it came from a vacuum, a political vacuum, and there appeared this officer, which was really an interesting person, but this personalization of a political process was negative, of course, because you cannot substitute a collective process by one interesting person. And so the interesting part of Venezuela was also its limits. Yeah, you could say. Yeah, Chavez made the process possible, but his person also put limits to the process. And now I think for 8-10 years already, there's a terrific or terrible process of degradation of this process. So I would say, oil, extractivism, and states were the tragedies of Venezuela.
Mm-hmm. With some ecological impacts as well. So I'm going to open up the floor now, and we'll just let you ask the first question.
So we've already heard a bit about sort of the enormous changes in the physical production processes that would be needed to avoid climate disaster and maybe also other ecological problems. Some people have compared this in scope to the efforts to mobilize for the world wars in terms of sort of transforming production towards the war effort and so on. And of course, during both world wars, even Western capitalist countries made enormous use of economic planning, sort of state-directed planning, to achieve this. So my question is, do we need something like economic planning, and what kind of economic planning would that be to avoid the climate disaster?
Whom do you want to answer?
More questions?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah, maybe we collect some questions already, because there are so many people queuing already. So maybe next question should be asked already.
Hey there, thank you so much for your talk. I admired and studied both your work, and I would like to hear a little bit more about the differences between your thoughts on this subject. What I heard was that when you, Nancy, spoke about capitalism, you spoke about them, the capitalists, and when you, Raul, spoke about the situation we are in, you spoke about we, the capitalists. So I wondered if maybe this is a path we would like to go down, and maybe you have thoughts on why that is. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Maybe one more question and then the first round of answers.
Yes, thank you. I have a question about, it's also about the differences or your perspectives on something that you already mentioned. It's kind of about the path to socialism. I really liked your idea, Raul, about socialism as a movement, and I understood this as a social movement. And my question is, if we imagine this as a social movement, and I was very happy that you mentioned Deutsche Wohnen and Co. enteignen, because I'm affiliated with them. And I think this is one important step on the way. But also, do we even have the resources as a collective to change, to make these systemic changes? Because it's so time-consuming. Or do we need changes on the legislative and executive level to free up time and resources to be a part of these processes of democratization? And I would also really like to hear your thoughts about that, Nancy. Thank you.
Soll ich mal anfangen? Might I start, Nancy?
Sure.
Well, I think we are already in a... Capitalism always is practicing planification. So I think it's not true that a socialist world is on planification and capitalism is non-planification. There's this funny book, The People's Republic of Walmart, which shows that the big companies today, they have a form of planification which was totally unthinkable in socialist societies. So the problem or the issue is not if we are defending planification or not, but to planification for what, or to benefits of who, yeah? So I would totally agree that for an ecological and social transformation of society, of course we need planification. And you see it actually, we had it with the issue of coal, and now we have it with energy administration, that the government has to assume these topics, or before with the COVID pandemic. So I think it is very clear, and that already there's a kind of political planification of economic process. So what we should demand is a democratization of this process, because Habeck now is making the planification as a representative of the interests of the big companies. Yeah? So we need a kind of planification which is built up on the workers of these industries, that could possibly be shut down if we get into problems of energy administration. So Klaus Dörre proposes Transformationsräte, councils of transformation, which could be built by labor unions, ecological associations, political organization of neighborhoods, and of course the industries too, because they are part of this process of transformation, and which could be a start to get into a social planification and orientation of the economy. So I think it is very clear we need to put the issue of planification on the agenda, and we have to say we need a democratic planification, and we have to make clear that already now there is a kind of political regulation, Steuerung, or planification of a lot of things, but without any democratic participation of us. The other issue is if we have to think about social movements only, and I would say no. I think what we need is a combination of all forms of developing counterpower. Yeah, I think we should go back to the state theory of Nico Poulantzas, who said that the state is a condensation of power relationships. I think that this would be the translation in English. Also Verdichtung von Kräfteverhältnissen is the term in German. And this means that state is not a sphere apart, but our social struggles are materialized on the state. And so I would argue that is what's happening with social movements. Social movements are important to mobilize society, but in a way to get them into a legislative text or into political regulation, you also need forms of institutional presence. And we could think if we need parties or if we just need a channel to execute pressure. But perhaps you know that I am a member of the board of the left party in Germany, and I'm coming from social movements, and I never would want to be a representative in the parliament, but I think that we need political parties, and especially if we want to develop social power from below, we need a kind of institutional articulation. So I would say it's not, we don't have to think about it as opposite terms, but we have to understand that social power from below always needs the real process of social self-organization. And that's why this campaign of Deutsche Wohnen was so important, because thousands and thousands of persons self-organized and made experiences of how to speak with neighbors and to organize neighbors. Yeah? And this was the real interesting thing of this campaign, I think.
Nancy, do you want to continue, or should we have some more questions already?
I think if you want me to say anything, I better do it now. I'll forget. I'll try to.
If I want you to
short.
say anything.
On planning, I'll just be very quick. It's true that that big corporations have internal planning, but I still believe that the sort of overall trajectory of capitalism is deeply anarchic, and that's a big problem because it's really blind. It's just going wherever the sort of functionally interlaced efforts to generate more profit happen to land us. So I think that we need planning that is really thinking about the overall course of development, that needs to become a problem for collective human intelligence and not left to the kinds of planning that already exist. Secondly, I loved this question about we versus them. I want to justify speaking about them. I really want to insist that the problem is the capitalist class, and that whether we call the us the 99% or the global working class in some very inclusive sense that includes care workers and peasants and unfree workers and so on, everybody. I think it's really, and this gets into this question about the path to socialism. For me, the theorist who is most on my mind is not Poulantzas, although he's very, very interesting. It's Gramsci. It's the problem of counter-hegemony and how to build a counter-hegemonic bloc. And I think that the most obvious way, the one that makes the most sense, both because I think it's sort of the true one, is there is a small group of people who have a lot of power and use it to screw everybody else. And that's simple-minded, but I think it gives us a good basis for thinking about how to assemble a coalition, a counter-hegemonic bloc of very diverse forces, which at first sight may not see each other as allies or may not seem to share much in the way of a diagnosis or even what their priorities, what their most pressing needs are. But if you had a kind of an account of where the main enemy is for everybody, then you have at least the beginnings of a counter-narrative. And I think that from the ecological perspective, the most important the narrative that we need a counter-narrative to is green capitalism. We need to sort of force a choice. You're either on the side of green capitalism or you're on the side of the 99% and the global working class and blah, blah, blah. But I don't think, so I'm thinking about this less in terms of using levers of institutional power, which I'm all for. I'm for political parties and labor unions and social movements and all kinds of associations, scientific associations, all kinds of professional groups and so on. But I'm really thinking in this almost, dare I say, Schmittian way. No one has ever accused me of being Schmittian, but of us versus them. I think we're at that point where it's so dire. And that's one reason that I want to insist on the importance of concerns for people's livelihoods. People who don't think of themselves as ecologically or environmentally minded, it's vitally important to communicate an ecological agenda, an eco-socialist agenda, in ways that do not suggest they're going to lose something. This is so important. It's not going to happen without considerable working class support from people who have all kinds of livelihood concerns and very legitimate concerns. And so our argument has to be, you will have security, you will have work, you will have a standard of living, and you will have so much more and better than you have now. So against the environmentalism of the rich, for the environmentalism of the working class, if not just the poor, and not single issue environmentalism. Single issue environmentalism is the environmentalism of the rich. It's the environmentalism of people who have nothing else to worry about because they're otherwise sitting pretty. This has got to be a movement that is linked up with feminist movements who may not have the climate crisis as item number one on their agenda. It's got to link up with Black Lives Matter and other anti-racist movements who, again, may be more worried in the immediate sense about being killed by a policeman, et cetera, et cetera. And so just as each of those movements have to draw that same line, are you for Sheryl Sandberg's feminism, or are you for the feminism for the 99%? I co-wrote a little book like that. Same thing. Are you for green capitalism or environmentalism, the 99%, et cetera, et cetera? Enough.
No. It was just going to sound from.
Okay, so in other words, a coalition, a counter-hegemonic coalition of anti-capitalist forces, some of which will have ecology as their number one and others not, but all with the same enemy. That's how I think about it.
Okay, so some more questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for organizing the talk and everything. I have one question because I really like the question for the event today, how green is socialism, but you didn't actually talk about it. You took it as a given and then started from there. Because what I'm wondering is, given the track record of really existing socialism, and also theoretically speaking, the Promethean kind of spirit that Marx and other socialists embodied, we will conquer nature and so on, and we will, Hegel I think called it humanization of nature. And given all this baggage, and also the not very good track record of really existing socialism, I think the only country is Cuba, which is in the ecological sweet spot, but that's more out of necessity than conscious planning. And so I was asking how green is socialism actually? And is this, yeah, that's my question.
Two more questions, please. But thanks for bringing this up, because this was supposed to be the third part, actually, that we didn't get to because we wanted to open up the floor. So.
Okay, thank you so much for being here tonight and presenting us your ideas. I'm a huge fan. So, despite the risk of maybe sounding too polemic, my question is, where would you place yourself on the spectrum between reformers and revolutionaries? Perhaps it's a continuous spectrum, perhaps it's a categorical one. And I just want to clarify quickly why I'm asking this question. It is because I've had the honor of reading your works about the crisis of capitalism and care. And you described some of the protective policies that were enacted during the time of Marx and Engels as merely muting the social contradiction at the core of capitalism. So I'm wondering, would you say that with all the ecological policies being enacted today, we're merely muting this contradiction, or do you see us actually realistically moving towards the green socialism that we need? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is also connected to these two other questions, because I wanted to go back to the state planification question, and if when we talk about state planification and democratization and so on, if we're talking actually about a problem of redistribution and not a problem of mode of production, and since we've been seeing this so to speak Keynesian turn during this corona pandemic times, and this state planification has been also discussed, at least here in Europe. I was wondering if it's sufficient, because now we've seen state and indebtedness and also the limits of state action during the pandemics, also in China, also here in Europe. And I was wondering if even this inversion of dominant classes, as Nancy was saying, to change the hegemonic kind of relations, if that's sufficient, because I mean, probably my question is on the limits of this transitional socialist strategy, and if Green New Deal is sufficient for our necessities, if it's not an anachronic, because maybe a New Deal during the 30s was possible in a capitalist context, but maybe it's not possible anymore, and we've seen these limits, and I wanted you to talk about. Thank you.
Okay. Great question.
So,
you want to start? No. Okay. These are all really great questions. Can I just say on really existing socialism? I mean, first, just a theoretical point. I don't believe that there is anything in the sort of deep structural logic of socialism as a system that incentivizes people to trash nature. Really existing socialist societies have done that, but not for those internally driving contradictory. Capitalism does it non-accidentally. That's a difference. And so it follows that socialism is a necessary condition for a good way of living with nature, for saving the planet, but not a sufficient one. It has to be the right kind of socialism, okay? But you know, if we go back to that systemic argument, the structural argument that we began with, then capitalism has something deep in it that gets in the way of this. I don't think socialism does. Socialism has had a lot of bad stuff, but not in its very essence, and that's an important difference. I also want to say on that second point, I'm just rediscovering a great environmental thinker namely Friedrich Engels, someone coming out of the Frankfurt School, who I always thought was, just some mechanical, stupid guy. Well, let me recommend John Bellamy Foster's new book called The Return of Nature, which reconstructs the tradition of socialist ecological thought from the time of Marx and Darwin and Engels up to, I don't know how far he goes, the end of the 20th century. It's focused especially in England, and it includes great figures like Engels and Morris. And if you read his account of Engels, a whole new picture emerges, which to me was, and even if you don't end up not liking Engels, you will see that there is a great tradition of socialist ecological thought. Unfortunately, it didn't, control state power in socialist societies, but it is there. Reform versus revolution. I think the changes we need ultimately are revolutionary. They involve very deep structural change. That doesn't mean that the way you get there is by storming the Bastille or some other kind of romantic images we have of what revolution looks like. And that's why I was referring to Gramsci earlier, by that whole process of, conquering minds, hearts, and levers of power in civil society. Last thing on planning. Let me just say, the Green New Deal. What the good thing about it is the attempt to put labor unions and ecologists in the same camp. It's to say that we're going to do this in a way that creates good jobs and so on. It addresses those livelihood concerns. But they're actual projects. Some of them actually understand the kind of job creation as precisely including your kind of collective infrastructure, including what we're now calling in the United States the infrastructure of care, not just roads and bridges, which I think is part of what you meant. Yeah. So, and this has got a feminist angle to it. It's about work for women as opposed to just construction workers and so on. Still, the limits, I would go back. You here in Germany developed a fantastic literature about the contradictions of the welfare state, Klaus Offe and all of that. That is highly relevant now to these questions about, can the state serve two masters, right? Capital and, right, and the people or the working class or whatever you want to call it. Is this really possible? And of course, there's also the big problem of the national frame, which I already mentioned. I mean, the reference to the New Deal, it's an American quasi-Keynesian, right, form of state-organized capitalism within a state. That might be, there might be issues on which such a thing, which are really at the state level, that, but we have so many issues that are transborder questions that can't possibly be the definitive word.
Okay, maybe a short answer, and then we have 3 more questions.
Yeah. Very short. No, it's boring because I agree with what Nancy said, but I just wanted to make a comment on this question of reform and revolution. Of course, it's clear that we need a radical break with the existing conditions, but the question is how to get there. And the experience shows that a radical discourse is not organizing the power to get there. So that's the problem of a revolutionary discourse, and that's the reason why revolutionary movements always have to think about how to materialize real changes, which means reforms under existing conditions, because only the experience that of little victories, of little achievements in the everyday's life show the people that it's worth fighting, that fighting is brings the results, yeah, and that's I think what is guaranteeing the mobilization of more people, because the people are not organizing because you tell them that revolutionary would be great. They organize themselves if they see that they can achieve something by fighting, by struggling, and that's why we think about where we have to think about this dialectics of reform and revolution, which is a really old issue. If you read Rosa Luxemburg, you will see that 110 years ago, this problem already was solved, at least theoretically.
At least theoretically. So we have 3 more questions. Please be short.
Yes.
Because we have a team of technicians here that, I already want to thank them. Vielen Dank, dass Sie hier sind heute Abend, and I don't want them to do overtime.
2 related points of difference. First of all, on Anthropocene versus Capitalocene and so forth, I think it's very important to think beyond capitalism in the past, to think of ourselves as a species. And partly it's because our nature as a species is different from other species in the sense that we took over the earth, long before the growth of capitalism. I totally agree with everything you both have said about capitalism. But I think it's important to think more outside the frame of capitalism. Partly, the past of our species has had a series of ecological disasters and problems. The ancient Near East was forested, for example, or there's a recent book on the crisis of the 17th century as a climate crisis. But more than that, we have to define ourselves not just against capitalism. We can't say capitalism is undemocratic, we are democratic. That avoids the questions of what we mean by democracy and so forth. So we have to think in a long-term way. And then the second point is I would not put so much stress on capitalism can't do it. It's very familiar that, the idea that capitalism will collapse and so forth, can't get through the depression and so forth. It's shallow. I think the kind of arguments you make for capitalism are very, very strong in themselves, and you don't have to predict whether or not it can do it.
Thanks. Also, 2 points. The first is very similar to Eli's first point. On the question of how or for which reasons social systems exploit or overexploit nature. And I fully share your counter analysis that there's intrinsic reasons to capitalism for doing so, and I believe, it's kind of undoubtable. Because of the profit orientation. However, I wonder whether the root cause of that is actually within capitalism, or whether it's not because capitalism exploits something that is pre-capitalist and thus exacerbates this. And that's maybe not needs, but deep-seated or very strong or motivating wants or desires for better well-being. There's this strong lure that capitalism has with regard to providing this. Whether true or not, the lure is still effective. So that's not Anthropocene versus Capitalocene, because these needs are, or not needs, but wants or desires are culturally constructed. However, they're deep-seated, strongly motivating. So wouldn't one need to think about these possibly root causes which are pre-capitalist, however exacerbated by capitalism? The second part is connected to that, which is, wouldn't one also need to think more about the downsides or potential negative consequences of alternatives? And that's playing the devil's advocate again. But if we think of what Raul Zelik, for example, referred to alternatives like the resurgence of thinking about the commons or so. What about potential downsides of these in terms of NIMBY, not in my backyard effects they might have, or if one does like you pointed to, Nancy, in forms of coalitions and rainbow coalitions, wouldn't there then need to be some form of more general state power to take action there? However, if that is the case, then isn't there more than a contingent link between real, or the idea of socialism and real existing socialism, and that state power then tends not to be democratically controlled, something we actually could observe after the crisis of 2001, 2007, and 2008, and now since 2020, whenever we have state power, do away with the ideology of weak states. I think that's been effectively done away with by what we could have seen over the last 20 years. However, isn't there the strong tendency then for state power to be used in non-democratic and then potentially even worse ways?
Sorry to rush you, but one very small question in the end, and then.
It's very small. For me, it's more of a pragmatic question for people that are sort of giving us tools to think how to change things and how to build either a movement or how to create a program on how to reach socialism. So for me, one of the questions is that we talk a lot about how the states can regulate or things like that, but also, as you, Nancy, in your work has pushed forward, there is a great crisis also of representation, especially when we need to face the limits of states. So my question is sort of, how do you see, or how can we create or build this international movement, as capital is international and can move like from one place to another, as Raul brought Harvey and other people, like capital fixes, and how they can move from one place to another. So when people or workers organize in one place, capital moves to another, and then there is also the limits for those countries that need to sometimes put extractivism on the agenda in order to solve proletarian issues. So if you see how we can sort of build this, breach this representation limit in order to create this program, and in order to better organize this movement, depending on how you see the way towards socialism. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we have 6 more minutes, 3 for each of you. And just pick whatever you want to answer.
Yeah, I just wanted to get back to this question of capitalism can solve ecological problems, and we should not insist too much on it. As I said before, I'm not trying to sell socialism as a model. So I would say, as Nancy said before, it's a necessary condition but not sufficient. And on the other hand, I would argue that my problem is not the analysis of capitalism as an ecological disaster, but the necessity of building anti-capitalist movements. Because if I think that ecological solutions are only possible with movements of decommodification, we need a consciousness of anti-capitalism. And so I think this would be my argument, that we have to strengthen these real anti-capitalist practices that put limits to commodification and valorization. And on the other hand, that it's not only the capitalist scene, but we have also to think about the role of humanity. Well, that's true. But on the other hand, I find very convincing what Jason Moore wrote about it, that he said we should not make this distinction between human beings and nature. We should think that nature always is produced by the beings on the planet. So human societies are formed by living creatures, and we are living in a permanent process of transformation of natures and production of natures. And the problem is for us, and not for the nature as an abstract thing, that we are destroying the web of reproduction in which our society can survive. So that's a problem for our society, not for the nature as an abstract construction.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I'm in that bind, Eli. I have a logical argument as to why capitalism can't do it. But from a political point of view, I've decided to call myself, and this is sort of a play on a famous expression by Gayatri Spivak, who wrote about strategic essentialism. I'm adopting the posture of strategic agnosticism. I'm going to work with anybody who wants to decarbonize the economy, who wants to eliminate sexism, who wants blah, blah, blah. You can call yourself a communist, you can call yourself a social democrat, I don't care. We'll see when we do it whether we still have capitalism or not. If we do, fine, we could end up in a worse place. One last point, maybe it's the same point. I'm still thinking about that Prometheism question, because I agree with Raul that we're in a disaster and we have to act fast. I think the best picture of revolution is that one great quote from Walter Benjamin. I'm in the Benjamin chair, I have to say Benjamin, which is, Marx thought that revolution was the locomotive of history, but maybe it's about pulling the emergency brake on the train, the runaway train. I think that's sort of, socialism is not going to solve every problem. You're right, the person who raised the point about state power always being an issue. That was David, I think. And it's certainly true that pre-capitalist societies have done stupid and damaging things to nature, but some of them actually learned from that and were, and didn't repeat it. Capitalism doesn't let you learn. That's a big problem with it. It blocks our learning process. I'm quoting Rahel Jaeggi, blocks our learning process. Is there one last point? Capitalism is global. How can we become global? That's a very important question. We do have to do it. I don't exactly know how, though.
To be continued, as I would like to say, and we will continue the discussion. Thanks to everyone. Thanks for an illuminating and inspiring discussion. Thanks to everyone at the Center for Humanities and Social Change who has been involved in planning and bringing this panel about. And as I already mentioned, thanks a lot to the technicians who have been here today, and of course to the audience and to the very interesting questions. So we will have a next roundtable on racial capitalism on May 13th, and we will have the Benjamin lectures, 3 lectures on the 3 phases of capitalist labor. I don't know, we have a poster here for those lectures. Yeah, thanks to everyone and have a nice evening.